Can you believe it's been 7 months since Metroid Dread came out? And to think, a year ago today, it was still a pipe dream that we didn't think would ever come true. Well, now the game is real, and it's brought new life to the ever-struggling Metroid franchise. While we still don't know if it beat Metroid Prime's record of 2.8 million units sold, the NPD for 2021 Switch games places it at number 11, just under Skyward Sword HD, which sold over 3 million units. And these don't even count digital sales. Safe to say, even if it somehow doesn't become the best-selling game in the series, Metroid Dread has made Samus as relevant as ever again, at least since the GameCube era. As a Metroid fan myself, the 2010s were rough to say the least. But here in the roaring 2020s, I feel more optimism. I find myself thinking what the future of Metroid could possibly be after the success of Metroid Dread. Now, I know what you're thinking, so stop typing that comment. Yes, Metroid Prime 4 is in the works, and if rumors are correct, then we might have a Metroid Prime remake as soon as this year. The key word in those titles, however, are Prime. We already know that 3D Metroid has a future. 2D Metroid, on the other hand, is up in the air. Heck, is it even going to be 2D Metroid in the coming years? More on that later. For now, we'll just refer to it as the Mainline series, as the Metroid Prime games are side stories that have no bearing on the mainline Metroid titles, which is why what comes after Dread is so interesting. Because Metroid Dread served as the conclusion of the story arc which began with the first Metroid on the NES. Now that that story has been told, where does it go from here? Gameplay and story-wise. Dread might have even given us some clues. Spoiler alert, by the way. It's been 7 months though. What are you doing? Now then, in Hanubia, you can see 2 docked spaceships in the background, and when you return to this area during the endgame race against the clock, they're gone. Could it be that they simply fell to the ground during the explosion, or did any of the remaining X-Parasites commandeer them and fly away to safety before planet ZDR's destruction? If the latter is true, that means the X-Parasites might be the antagonists in at least the next Metroid game, and maybe the one after that too? It would make sense given that Metroids are officially wiped out, with the exception of Samus, who became one thanks to the infusion of Metroid DNA. As was the case in Dread, this means she's the only one who can eradicate the X-Parasites for good, and if some of them escaped and made their way to other planets, that means she has some new bounties to complete. That said, if the X-Parasites aren't the antagonists in future Metroid games, where does that leave potential stories? The simple answer? Literally anywhere. That's the best part about the story arc between Samus and the Metroids ending. It opens the door for all kinds of tales to be told in the Metroid universe. No longer are future stories constrained by the events of previous games. As long as Samus remains a Metroid, thus keeping the series name accurate, then the possibilities for her future adventures are endless. New planets, new enemies, and new bosses. No more revisiting old worlds or fighting old foes. Speaking of that, anyone else kind of shocked that Ridley didn't appear in Metroid Dread? I really thought he would, but I'm kind of glad he didn't. He was in too many games. It was time for my boy Kraid to come back. Okay, I'm getting sidetracked here. While there could still be conventions from previous games, such as returning gear and traditional smaller enemies like Zoomers, the worlds and stories would be all new and potentially could carry over to multiple games afterward. This way, new players would be able to jump in without any knowledge of the games that came before. Honestly though, what intrigues me more than the possible stories of future Metroid games are the games themselves. Because now that the mainline Metroid story arc is over, perhaps the next few games could no longer be restricted to the 2D side-scrolling style of play. I should elaborate. I do not want 2D Metroid to go away ever. In the same way I don't want 2D Zelda or 2D Mario to go away. Both 2D and 3D styles of game have their place in this industry, and given the successful sales of Metroid Dread, audiences definitely want to see more of 2D Metroid. However, I would not be opposed to a new 3D Metroid in a style other than Prime's. And certainly in a style other than Metroid Other M's. I just wasn't a fan of that. Anywho, I would love to see another attempt at a third-person 3D Metroid game, whether that be made by Nintendo EPD, Mercury Steam, or a new developer like Next Level Games or Platinum, just to throw some names out there. The point is that it would be interesting to see different developers' interpretations of Metroid. Heck, we've already kind of seen that from games that don't have Metroid in their titles. The Batman Arkham games, for example, are some of the best 3D Metroidvanias of the last decade. The same goes for the new Tomb Raider trilogy, even if the last two games aren't as consistently great as the first one. And even though I'm not the biggest fan of Other M, it did lay the groundwork for what a 3D third-person Metroid could look like. The problem was that the environments weren't designed well enough for exploration, and the controls were, well, look at it. However, Samus's agility and prowess in battle was something that carried over later into Samus Returns and Metroid Dread. They were just in 2D and had way better controls. Of course, the prime example of 3D Metroid is the Metroid Prime trilogy. I'm not sorry. But those games do suffer from Samus feeling more bulky and slower to control than she does in the later 2D games. While I hope Metroid Prime 4 finds a way to remedy this, a new 3D Metroid could give us a faster, more agile Samus in the third-person perspective with controls that aren't this. In fact, a fan named Luto Akino has the very same idea, only with more of a retro twist. He recently shared that he's working on a version of Metroid that could have released on the Nintendo 64, which never got a Metroid game. His interpretation of a 3D Metroid is a platformer with third-person shooting and aiming. While it's still very early in development, it could serve as a blueprint for a solid game. After all, Nintendo already specializes in platforming and now shooting, as proven by the Splatoon games, making a third-person platformer shooter in the Metroid universe not too far-fetched. Beyond this, a 3D Metroid from the third-person perspective could accomplish so much more than a first-person or a 2D game could. Imagine Samus moving around a 3D space like in Prime, but with the enhanced speed and fluidity of her movement in Dread. That's the level of control we're talking about here. And even though that could theoretically be accomplished in a first-person Prime game, it would probably be easier to make a movement system like this for a third-person perspective, as the player would have a better view on where Samus is and what she's doing. I think of the Tomb Raider games and how Lara Croft performs all these wild stunts. It's easy for her to pull off, but if the players saw through her eyes, it would probably be a little more difficult and nauseating. In fact, like the Tomb Raider games, a 3D Metroid could incorporate climbing sections for traversal and puzzle solving. We already saw something like that with the spider magnet in Metroid Dread, so a climbing Samus isn't out of the question. And I have to talk about Batman again, because I love The Dark Knight and his Arkham games. They're great Metroidvanias in the way they incorporate gadgets to unlock previously inaccessible areas, but the combat in them is next level. Batman plows through thugs with ease thanks to his martial arts knowledge and arsenal of non-lethal tools. I'm not suggesting that Samus should ditch her arm cannon and bring hands to a gunfight, but Metroid Dread, Samus Returns, and Other M have shown that she can be absolutely brutal with her arms and legs when necessary. What I picture for a 3D Metroid game is shooting with the arm cannon over the shoulder Gears of War style, and being able to deal stylish melee combat if an enemy gets too close. It would basically be Metroid Dread's combat adapted to a third-person view. This sounds more like a Platinum game, doesn't it? I'd ask Kamiya, but he blocked me. Bitterness aside, a 3D Metroid could also take advantage of a third-person camera by displaying more of Samus's character. We saw this a lot during Metroid Dread's cutscenes, where Samus showed a great deal of expression through her eyes alone. Heck, she shows more personality through her face than she does saying her one line. Thing is, we're only able to see her face in certain cutscenes, but if there was a third-person Metroid game with a controllable camera, players could see it at any time. Assuming whoever develops this theoretical game lets her face be visible through the helmet and animates it depending on whatever situation she finds herself in. Games like The Last of Us 1 and 2 did this extremely well, with every character, player or not, showing incredible detail in their faces. This can be done for Samus, allowing the player to see what she's feeling at different moments. It would be an evolution of her helmet reflections in the Metroid Prime trilogy, something Prime 3 took advantage of by showing her deteriorating eyes through phase-on corruption. If this feature were to be implemented in a future game, obviously you wouldn't be able to see her face all the time through action sequences, but it's the attention to detail that makes the world she's in all the more real. And as we know, attention to detail is part of what makes the Metroid games great. Now the real question is if this theoretical 3D Metroid would be the blueprint going forward for Metroid. Prime games aside, is this how mainline Metroid will be for the foreseeable future? I don't think so. I believe there is still a place for 2D Metroid, and maybe the mainline series will continue being 2D, with every 3D entry being classified as a spin-off like the Prime games. It would be kind of jarring to me if Metroid 6 ever got announced and it wasn't a 2D game. Besides, 2D Metroid is too influential to ignore, as it invented the Metroidvania genre. Sure, it carried over to 3D with the Prime series and other games outside of Metroid, but 2D Metroidvanias are undoubtedly more popular and abundant than 3D ones. Even if 2D Metroid games somehow stopped being made for the rest of time, their legacy would carry over throughout all of gaming. Still, Metroid Dread was super successful, especially for a 2D Metroidvania that was fully priced, so I'm willing to bet my left hand that 2D Metroid is here to stay. But now that it's clear fans want more Metroid than ever before, this leaves a ton of possibilities for where the franchise can go beyond 2D and Prime. That's right, I'm talking Metroid Prime Pinball 2, baby! Wait, the baby. But what do you think? Where do you see Metroid going from here? Will there be more 2D games, or can we expect something different? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and check out the videos on the right for more topics you might be interested in. Until next time, bye.